In ancient times, all kings had at their courts a court fool. And sometimes it probably was true that the fool was a crazy person who had a peculiar capacity for making inappropriate remarks. And there's something about inappropriate remarks that can be very funny. I remember as a child we used to play a game in which we had first of all a booklet with a story in it, but every now and then a word was left blank. And then you were given a pile of cards that were shuffled around the players, and in turn, as the story was read by one person, the players turned up whatever card they had and said the word. And the most extraordinary things happened. And in this way, of course, the person who could make inappropriate remarks at the right moment can sometimes bring the house down. But actually, as time went on, the function of the fool became more sophisticated than that. And he became a person whose function was not simply to make jokes and to be a funny man, but to remind the monarch of his humanity, so that he would never get too stuffy. You remember perhaps the lines in Richard II, where the king says, within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of the king, keeps death his watch. And there the antic sits, the antic being the court fool. And there the antic sits, scoffing at his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a little time to monarchize, be feared and kill with looks. And then at the last comes death, and with a little pin bores through his castle wall, and farewell, king. But look here. I very briefly touched on pain yesterday. As Rex's with everything else that exists. Now, if death then is a joke, I remember the biggest joke on death I ever saw. I mentioned this in my book. We visited the Capuchin friars' crypt in the Via Veneto in Rome. Some of you may have seen it, where there are 3 underground chapels where everything is made of bones. And the altar is made of bones. The pedestals of the altar are all shin bones. And then there are piles of skulls, and the decoration of flowers on the ceiling are ribs alternating with vertebrae. And the vertebrae are the flowers, and the ribs curl this way, curl this way, curl this way, are the twining stems. And the whole thing is bones, and they have even a few full intact skeletons dressed in monks' robes standing on either side of these altars. It's the craziest thing you ever saw. And then when you have seen it and you come out, there is a little friar with a beard taking your offering at the top of the steps. And he had a funny, wicked gleam in his eye. And one could see that this was a joke. The whole thing was a joke. It was constructed by people who had somehow overcome the fear of death. Couldn't possibly have such a thing as that. And so I was fascinated by it, because I thought that on the day of the resurrection, there's going to be a tremendous scuffle, fitting all those bones together and everybody getting up the stairs for the Last Judgment. Well, So if it is seen that death is the jest, but the question is, you see, we are so tormented by the bugbear of it being the real end, by the imagination of the possibility of being in the dark forever. Now, you really must think this through, because it is a pure delusion. If you think, first of all, seriously about annihilation of consciousness, you will realize that annihilation of consciousness couldn't possibly be an experience. But being in the dark forever could be an experience. I mean, supposing you were buried alive and somehow you were immortal, but you had to stay shut up in a tomb for always and always and always. That would be pretty grim. But the annihilation of consciousness is not an experience at all. There isn't anything there to be afraid of. So if that's what's going to happen, there's nothing to worry about, I assure you. But on the other hand, if you think about it longer, about a state of eternal just not being at all, you know, you realize that nature abhors a vacuum. And that since, just as the universe happened once, it can happen again, since you were born once, you know, it did happen, really. Well, it can happen again. Only the next you won't remember the one now, just as the one now doesn't remember the one before. Not because you've forgotten, but because memory is transmitted along certain channels. It requires the vehicle of brains, for example. It requires books and other records to maintain it. But as I pointed out yesterday, the fundamental what have you that underlies all this doesn't need a memory. Doesn't need to store memories. And so just in the same way as you don't need to be conscious of the inner formations of your brain. Also, I mean, here I'm talking speculatively. Also, there are curious connections where we don't see any. That is to say, the interval between events is not insignificant. Just as you don't hear melody unless you hear the interval between tones. It's the interval that counts. So in the same way, blank intervals between successive manifestations of the universe and blank intervals between your forgetting who you are altogether and dying and someone suddenly becoming a baby. The blank intervals are not insignificant. Every painter knows, every architect knows that the space around an object or inside an object is just as important as the object. That, again, is the fact. If you don't notice the importance of intervals and you don't notice the importance of space, it is as if you had settled on the carpet here for the black design being the thing and the white background as having no significance. So what about the inside of this room? What about the shape of space that it encloses? We would say this is nothing more than a certain quantity of air. But don't you see that the distance, the space between that wall and this window is life room? That it's not nothing, that it's just as important. It comes into being at the same moment as the walls come into being. It connects them. And so likewise the space between our planet and other planets is not insignificant. So once you see that intervals of apparent nothingness are significant intervals, that their size makes all the difference to what's happening. When the intervals between dits are short, the note is high. When the intervals between the dits are long, the note is low or large, the high being little. See, why do we say high and low as distinct from little and big? Big instruments make big noises, little instruments make tiny noises. But at any rate, it's the interval that's important. So then, once you see the importance of the interval, you have seen that the white is as important as the black, or the other way round, if you want to change your analogy. Do you see how you can switch these analogies? In one case, the white can be the nothing, the unimportant, whereas the black is the mark somebody made with a crayon. Or the other way round, the black can be the darkness, and the white is the flash of lightning that appears in the darkness. Change your analogy. It's like saying, once we used to say about high matters, high matters, lofty thoughts. But now we don't. It's more fashionable to say deep matters and profound thoughts. Someone was telling me yesterday in the group here that they were going to an Indian village in New Mexico where they had Christianity, but when the speaker referred to Jesus and God and so on, he pointed down all the time. Because, you see, he felt that things grew up like this from below. Whereas, of course, the ancient cults out of which the Jewish and Christian religions grew had the idea that the life of the sun and the rain came down from the heavens and fertilized the feminine earth, which then responded. But these things keep changing, because you can keep switching your point of view. You can see the black as the design against the white background, and the white as the design against the black background, and you can flip back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And the more you do that, the more you realize that the pairs go together. Anxiety is the state of trying not to flip. All life is flipping. It's called, its flip-flopability is the condition of life, this way and that way. When you're trying to resist flip-flopability, you're anxious. You see? When you push against it, it throbs in a way that you interpret as fear. And all rigid personalities, people who can't swing, who have no movement in their hips, as it were, psychologically, they are resisting flip-flopability. But when you understand flip-flopability, and that this is the way things are, then you laugh, because that is the big flip-flop. This morning I was discussing the joke of death, and the principal point that I was making was that death and life, or that is to say, in other words, the interval and the event, death being the interval between events, between one appearance and another of human beings, in the same way as winter is the interval between the appearance of the leaves in spring and their disappearance in the fall. But there is, you see, the chronic fear that the interval may be all that there is, that the interval may triumph, and there may be no event. And I was trying to show you that there is a polarity between the event and the interval between events, in such a way that you can no more have the one without the other than you can have the crest of the wave without the trough. And that this goes on and on and on in endless cycles, where there are small intervals making up small intervals and waves which group together and make up a set of intervals and waves, and they in themselves constitute the crest of a larger wave with a much longer trough. And then again there comes the group of intervals and waves on a short rhythm. And that this thing that goes like, you see, like this, you see, that this thing in its turn is the crest of a still greater wave, and that the nature of being is that this is the scheme of things. But the joke about it, what makes it exciting, is the constant anticipation that there might not be anything again after the interval, that it might all come to an end. And the real problem, in order to turn death into a joke, that is to say, suddenly to recover from this terrible anxiety that it might be finished, and then transmute the vibration trembling of anxiety into laughter. It is the same thing. Only the trembling of laughter is the trembling of anxiety seen from a different point of view. Now, what are the things that are obstacles to our being able to see that? It's almost as if life were itself a guru. And you know how gurus throw out tests to their students to see if they can pass these various initiations, all of which require nerve in the face of some formidable obstacle. All fairy stories are full of this. And so life itself throws out all kinds of reasons for supposing that we are faced with something serious instead of something playful. And I want to discuss with you a few ways which in Western history this obstacle has been thrown out, and how we today are bamboozled by these obstacles. In the history of Western civilization, there have really been, in the past 2,000 years, two dominant mythologies. One has had a long run and the other has had a fairly short run. But they are both ways of terrifying you so that you won't see the point. But at the same time, they are perhaps not merely negative things, but challenges, barriers of the same kind that a guru would offer. For example, in the study of Zen, each koan is referred to as a barrier. And if you can pass the barrier, you see, you get in. But the function of the teacher is to put the barriers up to see how you'll react to them. So, in a way, we could say that the two great mythologies which have dominated the Western world in the past 2,000 years are two barriers. The first, of course, is the Christian mythology. And in the Christian mythology, the individual is made to feel that he is strictly on probation, that he does not really belong, that if he is at all a son of God, he is so by adoption and grace. He isn't really one of the family. Let me explore the theology of that a moment. In Christian theology, God has only one Son. The monogenes, or the only begotten Son of God, who is the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, the divine idea of itself. The Trinity constitutes a family, and naturally it's therefore threefold, because all for the Greek mind, and it was the Greek mind that molded Christian theology, meaning entirely depends on the structure of the Greek language. And Greek, in common with all Western languages, and indeed also Sanskrit, from which it is derived, has a sentence structure in which there is the subject, the verb, and the predicate. And we can't make any sense without those three things. We have to have an I love you or an I know you sentence for there to be any love or for there to be any knowledge. There must be the lover. The lover can't love without having a beloved, and the lover doesn't relate to the beloved without the relationship of love between them. So there you have the subject, the predicate, and the verb. And so naturally, in Greek ideas, the very inner nature of reality of the Godhead itself must be threefold, following the structure of Greek thought and Greek grammar. So, in this way, the inner life of the Godhead is completely self-sufficient. There is the Son, the object of God's love, so that God doesn't need any created world of finite beings as the necessary object of his love, so that he can be love. You see? So then, the created world is something extraneous. It's something that the Lord threw off in a fit of exuberance. And although it is very much beloved by him, he doesn't in any way depend on it. He, in a sense, fathered it, but he fathered it out of nothing. It had no true mother. And so, in a way, it's an orphan. And the relationship between the Creator and the creature in popular Christianity has always been the relationship between the king and the subject. And the relationship between the king and the subject is very, very strange, estranged, because the king, in the archetypes of kingship which existed in the Near East in ancient times and upon which this theological imagery was originally modeled, the king was really afraid. He always appeared in the throne room with his back to the wall. He didn't stand in the middle of his people and say, you know, and look around at everybody like that. He stood with his back to the wall like this. It's funny how all altars, Buddhas and things, have their backs to the wall, because there you can't be stabbed. And you have your guards and your henchmen on either side of you. And all the people prostrate themselves, because that way you can watch them all. They can't see you and you can see them. So you're safe. And that's the imagery, you see, which has given us our Western conception of God. Of the Father whose children have become a little bit too much for him. He's had too many. And they have to be kept in their place. And so he's a little bit frightened. And so the rules are set up. You just do so and so and so and so. And you must feel grateful for having been fathered. You're a miserable worm, and therefore inwardly, because without me you might not have been. You owe everything you have to my having produced you, and you are a debtor. And because you are a debtor, you have a duty. Duty is the same word as debt, debit. You owe life to me who produced you, although I won't admit I had a great deal of fun doing it. And so you must all crawl. Now, you see, that conception of our relationship to reality has been the popular idea for centuries in the Western world. So that you never really knew where you stood with the authority. Because the authority gives you the impression that you are so bad intrinsically that at any time you ought to be punished and eaten up. And it's only a matter of mercy that you're not being eaten up. So the prayers of the Christian church are full of the idea, O Lord, we are not worthy, and since it is only of thy great mercy that we continue to survive at all, we humbly beseech thee, etc., etc. Imagine. going around with that feeling about the nature of reality, that it is watching you all the time, that you're always on probation, like a released prisoner. And therefore there is an all-seeing eye at every moment of the day and night surveilling you, much more efficiently than any big brother could watch you through tiny TV cameras in your bedroom. I know a friend of mine who is a devout Catholic, and in her toilet, but she is different, she has a sense of humor. And in the toilet, you know, it's an old-fashioned one, there's a tank and a pipe coming down to the john, and there's a little placard on it with a big eye painted. And in Gothic letters underneath it, it says, "Thou, God, seest me." So always, everywhere, according to this mythology, there is the eye of the paternal judge watching you. Now, what can you do with a situation like that? If that's the way things really are, you don't know whether this Lord has a sense of humor, and whether you can say to him, "Hey, look, don't take such an advantage of me like that. Turn down that light a little. Close off your eyes sometimes. You don't need to be all that particular. You know I can't do anything to you. I can't knock you over. Why do you need to bug me all the time?" The sort of attitude is too much. And so people couldn't stand it. You know, 600 years of it was enough. And it became intolerable, really intolerable, because everybody knew they were sinners and that they were doing all the things against the rules in the book, and nobody could possibly put up with it. So the only thing they could do to relieve themselves of this horrible father figure was to make out that the universe didn't have a father at all. That it was really an orphan, not even virgin born. It didn't even have a mother. In other words, in order to escape from the mythology of a conception of ultimate reality which was much too intelligent and much too nosy, people had to invent a conception of the ultimate reality that was completely banal and dead. So the second Western mythology is the mythology of the mechanical universe, which is a fluke emerging from a process of absolutely blind energy. And you must notice the language in which the great thinkers of the 19th century thought about the world. Freud, for the basic psychic energy, used the word libido, which in 19th century Vienna was exceedingly uncomplimentary. Libido, blind lust. And so in the same way, the science philosophers of the 19th century talked about the world as being based on brute force, unintelligent energy, and worked out a conception of man as a really rather unfortunate natural fluke. Consciousness, reason, and indeed also the passions and feelings and desires of the human heart, were nothing but the end product of a roulette wheel of natural selection. It's the most curious paradox that those philosophers of the 19th century who denied the supernatural origin of man and who insisted that man is simply a part of nature, one of the members of nature, nevertheless set up a state of alienation between man and nature without precedent. I am a part of nature. I am something that nature fluked into being, but nevertheless this fluke is something that nature doesn't care about. It doesn't care about my ego and its future. All that is important to nature is the species. The individual is irrelevant. At the same time, this philosophy arose when we were becoming conscious of the sheer magnitude of the universe. And it took the first impression of this vastness as a pretext for making little of human beings and saying, what do you matter in this huge cosmos? You're just a little fluke. You're just a little nothing at all. This thing goes way on beyond all imagination. And therefore man is just so much fungus on a rock. And a very tiny rock at that. In other words, it took the standpoint let's set up a scale between two limits. We will, and this is the traditional Western opposition. On the one end of the scale to the left here, you have matter, the inert, the clay put into shape by the potter. On the other end of the scale you have spirit, which is intelligence. And these are what the mathematicians call limits. And a limit is something you approach, but you never actually get there. Now, what the 19th century mythology did was to think of all things towards the limit called matter. It said, in effect, there is this dead material stuff. It is energetic, but the energy is unintelligent. It's a kind of roaring mechanical energy like fire or electricity or so on. It is not intelligent. And everything is really that. What we call human intelligence and consciousness are merely complicated forms of this primordial energy. And they are nothing but that. In the same way, we are evolved from lower orders of animals, and I can trace my ancestry to a protoplasmal globule, Pooh-Bah says. And, that's what you really are. You're only a complicated protoplasmal globule. Now, do you see the intent behind this mythology? The intent is to deprecate. The intent is, as we say now, to put down the human being because the human being felt that hitherto he had been put up too far in the wrong way. You are a child of God, and the Lord loves you very dearly, but, you know, that's just insufferable to be put up in that way. You have an immortal soul. Your life is endless, but it can very well turn out to be a life of endless agony when you fry in hell. And that was a very serious threat to both Protestants and Catholics. And so it's much better, much more comfortable to have a dead universe than a living universe so everlastingly threatening. So then, the mythology of the 19th century, under which most of us still operate, because we operate under it because it has become so plausible. The science out of which this mythology arose has been so effective, it has produced such a marvelous splash of technological marvels, that its point of view, or the point of view of those scientists who started the whole thing going, has become amazingly persuasive and convincing. After all, if I can reach into your brain with a very, very subtle instrument, and I can poke about inside and press there, and suddenly, on a certain point when I press it, a world of memory comes to life so vividly that you see it before your very eyes. I remove the instrument, it vanishes. I touch another place. You experience intense pleasure, absolutely unbelievable pleasure. I remove it, the sensation vanishes. Every time I touch inside, you get a sensation externally of intense reality. And I say, after all, I was only just pushing things in your brain. You see what a push-button thing you are? That's it. I can just poke around and you can see anything. But all that's happening is I'm putting a little electrode or something on certain parts of your brain. That's all you are, poor fish. You're just that kind of a sensitive sponge inside your head bone. Well, that gets very persuasive, you see. And people are therefore in a position, they are prejudiced to favor a mythology that will make out that you are, after all, nothing but something or other. Nothing but a kind of complicated neurological jello. And that point of view, as I said, has become enormously convincing. It's plausible today, whereas the old point of view of God the Father and all the angels isn't plausible. It seems kind of weird in relation to what we know about the state of the universe. Now, what we have to see is that both of these points of view are equally mythological, and there's no more reason to take one than the other. And that what these points of view reflect are nothing other than certain attitudes to living. Now, you see, if you want to live in a way that always is saying, I think that life is disgusting, supposing you want to deny being, then you can always describe it in ways that are offensive. You can always say playing the violin is just scraping cat's entrails with horsehair. That puts it down, and you say, and you say people who play golf, they're a bunch of idiots who go out on take a walk, and they hit a stupid little ball with sticks. Or that people who like music are just a bunch of idiots who sit around and go out of their minds listening to a lot of complicated noises. See, there's always a way of talking about something to make it sound terrible. Equally, there's a way of talking about something to make it sound great. Now, what do you want to do? Do you want to live your life in such a way that you're always saying to it, Do you want to? Is that a good way to conduct things? Or do you want to live your life in such a way that you say, "Come on, let's go"? You see, let's swing this thing. On the one hand, you see, you're always in tension against it. Do you remember I pointed out to you in this morning that the person who's anxious, constantly anxious, is the person who is resisting the flip-flopability of things. Life is vibrating. It's going bloop, 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 bloop all the time, and the anxious person says, "God's sake, don't do that." Because, you might do it too much. I don't want to blurp like this. It makes me feel nervous. Stop it. And so, as he puts his weight on this blip, blip, he goes like this. You see, it gets tripping. So instead of saying, "Come on, let's blip," see, let's go, and do this thing. So in exactly the same way, the person who wants to say, "Well, you're nothing but some kind of chemicals,"